Good afternoon. As you said, last year I had the opportunity to come here and talk about the Redux ecosystem. It was my first ever public conference talk, and I spent at least 3 weeks trying to put the slides together. Today's talk is slightly different. Last night I was talking to Andrew. Sarah Vieira was originally scheduled to speak at this conference, and she was unable to make it. And last night Andrew was talking about having this extra slot and trying to take care of it. And I kind of half-jokingly volunteered to fill in and talk about Redux. And then they took me up on it. So I spent this morning trying to throw some slides together. If you see any typos, I have a very good excuse. So, for those of you who may not know me, my name is Mark Erikson. I am an answerer of questions. I spend a lot of time answering questions on Stack Overflow and React-Redux and Reddit and a lot of other places online. I am a collector of interesting links. I have maintained a couple lists of links to articles and useful resources for React and Redux, as well as Redux add-ons. I'm a writer of very long blog posts, primarily talking about how to use React and Redux in various ways, as well as my opinions on good Redux usage patterns. And I am a Redux co-maintainer. I wrote the Redux FAQ page, as well as the docs sections on structuring reducers. And generally, if Redux is mentioned anywhere on the internet, you can probably find me popping up shortly thereafter. If you don't know me for any of those things, then it's possible you might know me as that guy with the Simpsons avatar. It's still sort of a running debate just how much I actually resemble that. Slight difference in the skin shade, but I think it's some resemblance anyway. So today I'd just like to give you a few updates on what is going on in and around the world of Redux. So let's start with a question. Is Redux dead? The answer to that, of course, is no, despite all the fear, uncertainty, and doubt you may have been hearing lately. There has been a lot of discussion about Redux and its use cases and other things that might replace Redux. It seems that a new wave of this discussion breaks out on Twitter about every 2 or 3 months. Back in March, I wrote a blog post called Redux, Not Dead Yet, in which I attempted to explain how some of these other tools might actually relate to Redux and whether Redux does actually still have any benefit. I can also recommend a blog post from Dave Sedia entitled Redux versus the React Context API. So some of the common things you'll hear is Apollo and GraphQL totally replace the need to ever use Redux. The new React Context API means you don't need Redux anymore. Suspense or different things like that. And my answer to that is that yes, in various cases, you might not need Redux for certain things. If the only reason you were using Redux is to avoid passing props through multiple levels in your React component tree, then yes, the new React Context API can solve that particular use case. If you were only using Redux to store data that was fetched from the server, and you happen to be using GraphQL, then yes, it's likely that the Apollo client can help replace Redux for that kind of use case. But there are lots of additional reasons to use Redux besides that. So, like anything, you look at the different tools that are out there, you evaluate your options, and you see if any of these tools are good fits for what you're trying to do. Another big thing that's going on right now is React-Redux version 6 development. Our current version is version 5. And it uses the old legacy React Context API to make the Redux store accessible to your nested connected components. And every single one of those connected components is a separate subscriber to the Redux store. So if I had a connected list with 10,000 connected list items, that's 10,001 separate subscribers to the Redux store. In version 6, we are trying to rewrite it so that we use the new React Create Context API to pass down data. And as part of that, we're actually switching it so there's only one subscription to the store, and it's actually inside the provider component that you normally put at the top of your application. There are some interesting trade-offs in this. We're hoping that, number one, the React-Redux API will stay almost entirely identical between version 5 and version 6, so then in most cases, you should just be able to bump the version in your package, and that'll be it. One breaking change that we've seen is if any of you are using the with ref option to actually gain access to your wrapper component, we're planning on switching to using React's new forward ref API. So if you are using the with ref option, that will probably be going away in version 6. We're also hoping that using create context will make React-Redux more compatible with some edge case scenarios with the upcoming async React changes to how React renders. Down the road, we are open to potential discussions on new and different API forms we might implement. The most commonly asked for thing is a render props API for Connect. I know there's a lot of people out there who are render prop fans. We're probably not doing that in version 6. We're open to discussions and ideas for that or other potential approaches in a future version 7. So the goal right now, try to keep your code as untouched as possible. We'll take care of reworking the insides so you can hopefully just drop it in. So right now we've got 2 pull requests that are kind of competing implementations to rework the guts to use create context. Right now, all the test cases pass with some appropriate changes, and we've published both of those on NPM under the next 995 and next 1000 tags. I would actually request that people please go ahead, try these out in your application. Let us know, like, if anything obviously breaks, what the overall performance seems to be, so we can start getting some real feedback on whether these are getting close to being something that would be usable. We've been trying to do some performance benchmarks so we can see if these new PRs actually run roughly as fast as version 5. I'll talk about that a little more in a second. We're investigating some possible advanced performance optimizations. I think that the pieces are there to maybe make some of this work. The question is how much might be automatically done for you versus maybe having to manually specify some pieces of information for us up front. But I have hopes that in the long term, there would be some definite improvements. In the long run, we're still not yet sure exactly how Redux is going to work with the really advanced async capabilities the React team has talked about, like suspense and time slicing and stuff. There's some ways we can make it more compatible. There's other ways that Redux and React are wanting to do things differently, and we haven't had the time to really dig into that and figure out what the best solutions are. I'm hoping the React team will be publishing some more information in the next couple months so that we can figure out how to make that stuff work right. Just to give you an idea what some of the numbers look like. So we've got some artificial stress test scenarios in a benchmark repo that we've put together. So you can see from the numbers, we're trying to measure FPS, we're trying to capture Chrome performance traces for these different benchmarks. What we're generally seeing is that our 2 version 6 PRs are a little bit slower than version 5 in these heavy artificial stress test scenarios. A lot of that is because React actually has to get involved right away and re-render most of the tree in order to pass things down through context. So we're hoping to, and there may be some ways to speed up some of these things. We'll keep you guys posted. Something else that has me really, really excited. If you hear discussions about Redux, or especially you look at people's complaints about Redux, the number one thing that tends to pop up is the word boilerplate, and not in like the start a project sense, and the I'm typing too much code sense. And I've tried to have discussions and get ideas for what specific things do people actually mean when they throw out the word boilerplate. And there's a bunch of different things that people mention. The fact that I have to define action type constants, the fact that I have to write action creator files, the fact that I have to write complicated immutable update logic, and so on. People use Redux in lots of different ways. We're not going to be able to magically fix everyone's problems, but I take these concerns very, very seriously. And so earlier this year, I put together a very small proof of concept library that I dubbed redux-starter-kit. And the goal is not to solve everyone's problems, but rather to try to provide some simple solutions for the most common concerns that many people have. Right now, this package is available on NPM as a scoped package under my username. We do hope to make this into an official Redux branded library, move the repo into the GitHub organization. I believe the other maintainer has the name Redux Start available, so we might wind up using that for the name. If people have any better suggestions for the name, I'm open to ideas. So what does this starter kit have in it? So the first thing it has is a utility function called configure store. And the idea is that setting up a Redux store usually takes several different steps, especially if you're trying to do something like, say, set up some middleware and add support for the Redux DevTools extension. So what configure store does is it has some nice opinionated defaults for the most common ways you would want to set up a Redux store, and it provides a little bit of a different API for passing in these options. So for example, I could pass in a pre-made root reducer function, or I could provide the object full of slice reducers, and it'll automatically call combine reducers for you, just so you don't have to do it yourself. If you want to add middleware, instead of having to explicitly call the apply middleware enhancer yourself, you can pass in an array of middleware, and it'll call that for you. In fact, if you don't provide any middleware at all, it'll actually add Redux Thunk out of the box, because everyone complains that we don't include it by default. So there you go. It also will set up the Redux DevTools extension by default. In fact, you actually have to tell it not to add the DevTools extension by default. And you can pass in the arguments as an object with some different fields rather than positional parameters to create store. So it's a small function. It's like 20, 25 lines long, but it tries to handle the most common use cases for setting up a Redux store, just so it's one less thing you have to do yourself. Okay, how many of you have ever heard of a library called Immer? Okay, I'm actually seeing some hands out there. That's a good sign. For those of you who have never heard of Immer, it's a library created by Michelle Westrate, who also created MobX. And I would say that writing immutable update logic is one of the biggest pain points for working with Redux, especially when you're dealing with nested state. For example, up there you can see that if I want to update state.first.second bracket sumarray.value, then I have to do multiple object spreads, and I need to map over the array. It's annoying, because I really just wanted to update one nested field. What Immer lets you do is you call a function called produce, and you pass in your original state. And you pass in a callback function, and the callback gets what looks like the original state you just handed in. But inside that callback function, you can directly mutate and modify this draft object safely. And what produce does is it wraps your state in an ES6 proxy and records all the changes you're trying to make. And then it automatically applies those updates immutably, as if you'd written all the spread, slice, concat, map stuff yourself up on the top. So these two examples are exactly the same, assuming I didn't typo anything. So you can see that the Immer example is a lot shorter. It's one line. It's a lot easier to read. So in Redux Starter Kit, so the other common complaint we get is apparently half the world hates switch statements. I don't know why, but people do. And so the Redux docs already show you how to write a utility function called createReducer that takes a lookup table of action types to functions that handle those cases. And there's 5 million libraries out there that implement their own version. So we've thrown one into Redux Starter Kit, except that we actually use Immer inside the create reducer utility. So if you look at this example, you can see that both add to do and toggle to do appear to be directly mutating the state that they're given. But because we pass these to the create reducer utility, it's actually safe to do so because it's using immer under the hood. Now, let me reemphasize that. If you use like add to do by itself, it will directly mutate the state because the code is actually mutating. But if you pass it to the magic create reducer utility that has immer inside, then it's safe and everything works properly. In all honesty, the fact that it's not clear that this is working immutably is my biggest concern with this. But the goal is that hopefully it does help you save a lot of lines of code and make your reducers shorter to work with. We're also working on something called create slice. And this is pretty much a direct port of a library that Eric Elliott created called Autodux. The idea is that you basically tell us, here's maybe like the name, like the state key name that I care about, some initial state, and my reducer functions, and we'll automatically generate the action types, action creators, hook up the reducers using immer, and maybe even toss in some selectors as well. We've got some code that's been written. We need to figure out how to integrate it properly, but you could potentially generate a bunch of useful stuff with one function called this way, and you wouldn't have to write these by hand. Another complaint that people have raised is, well, whenever I use Redux, I have to also install Redux thunk. I have to install reselect, and so on. So we've included a dependency on a package called selectorator, which is kind of like an improved version of reselect, and just sort of re-exported it. So we don't do anything special. We just import here, re-export there. So it's at least one less dependency you have to manually install yourself. The selectorator package lets you actually pass in some key paths as strings rather than writing like little one-line lookup selectors yourself. There's still some debate on whether we actually want to include this in a final version. If you have any feedback on that, please let me know. The last major thing that's going on around Redux at the moment is documentation stuff. I have a special interest in this because this is how I kind of got involved with Redux in the first place. So the first thing we're trying to do is actually rewrite the React-Redux docs from scratch. Frankly, the React-Redux docs are kind of lousy. It's a single markdown file in the React-Redux repository. It's like this long, and it's really pretty jargon heavy. For example, how many of you are familiar with what I refer to as the object shorthand argument for map dispatch, where you can pass an object full of action creators instead of a function? Okay, the fact that only like 5% of the hands went up disturbs me, because that's like one of the most useful things that React-Redux lets you do. Okay, side note. You don't have to write a function called map dispatch. You can actually, okay, we're gonna try to. Okay, so normally what you do is let's see, let me zoom this in. Dispatch equals more, bigger. Okay, let's see if that's good enough. Yes, I'm watching. It's an improved version of Notepad. Thank you. Okay. Okay. So normally, what you would do is return an object that says like add to do, and you want to have a function that captures the dispatch, calls the add to do action creator, and passes it in. Or maybe you use the bind action creators utility from Redux. Let's see. Action creators dispatch to do the little wrapping for you automatically. You don't have to do this. All you have to do creators. Put the add to do and toggle to do action creator functions into an object. Connect, map state, action creators, my component. And it does that bind action creators call for you automatically. To me, there is actually never a good reason to write an explicit function named map dispatch. Write action creators, use the object shorthand, saves you a few lines for every connected component. So that actually proves my point. The information that you can do this is in the API docs. But you have to squint very carefully at one specific paragraph, and it's really not called out very well. So what we're trying to do is set up a complete set of docs like we have with the main Redux documentation site. We actually just had the first big piece of this merged in, a getting started page that kind of walks you through taking a React component, hooking it up to React-Redux, some of the capabilities of connect and provider, and so on. We're going to have sections on actually using React-Redux in various ways. Like, how are you supposed to write a map state function? What are the different forms of binding an action creator and getting that hooked up? We're going to have an advanced usage section that talks about performance optimizations, some of the lesser known options to connect, and so on. We'll have a section talking about how the library actually works internally, both at a conceptual level and specific implementation details. And then we'll have the API reference, which will hopefully be a little bit cleaned up and easier to read. We're also hoping to do a revamp of the main Redux docs as well. Dan had some great tweets when he wrote the original documentation in 2015, where he talked about all the different audiences he was trying to target at the same time. It has to make sense to people who are familiar with existing Flux libraries and want to know how Redux is different, people who have used RxJS and don't understand what this Redux thing is, Backbone users who have no idea what any of this is, etc. The landscape is a little bit different at this point. Like, most of the world has forgotten that any of the other Flux libraries ever even existed. So we want to kind of rethink some of the assumptions that are in the docs. There's also a few areas that I don't think are covered very well. And really, we don't really have a good section on real-world usage. We've got a basic tutorial. We've got an advanced tutorial. And then it sort of jumps into like the FAQ and some random scattered recipes and stuff. And we don't really have a good coherent section that talks about building a meaningful React-Redux app from the ground up. So I really want us to get a good section on that. I also want to toss in something that actually has some suggested opinions. The Redux docs are deliberately very unopinionated. We present lots of different ways you can do things, but without telling you how you ought to do things. And a lot of people would like us to give opinions, so we'll try to give some opinions. I'd also like to see us have some runnable code sandbox examples embedded in the docs themselves, so that as you're going through the tutorial or something, you can actually play with some of the pieces right there. And hopefully improve the overall doc structure and have a little more split between the how you do something and the why it works this way part. The middleware page in particular spends way too much time explaining why middleware work this way, and before it actually gets around to, well, here's how you actually write one, here's how you add them to your store, and so on. So, requests for feedback. Many requests for feedback. Please try out the React-Redux version 6 PRs in your own app. Let us know what breaks, file issues, contact me personally, and we'll see how well things are working. Please try out the starter kit and tell us, is it helping you in your app? Is the code better? What other pieces ought to be included out of the box with it? Please take a look at some of the docs work that we're doing and let us know what pieces ought to be included in the docs. Get involved. I've got a bunch of issues open on our perf benchmarks repo. Would certainly appreciate some help fleshing those out. We can always use more assistance filling out the docs as well. I'll be around here today and until mid-afternoon tomorrow. Please come and find me, talk to me here, or Twitter, React Flux, Slack, wherever else afterwards. And I look forward to having people continue to use Redux. Thank you.